The white lace of the altar cloth didn't burn at first. It curled, blackening at the edges as the heat from the fallen candelabras licked the hem. Atop the marble sat Seraphina's veil, a delicate cloud of Brussels lace now marred by a spray of deep, visceral crimson. To the gasping crowd of London's elite, it looked like the Duke had simply failed to show a public execution of Seraphina's reputation. But as the first ribbon of smoke rose toward the vaulted ceiling, the truth became far more lethal. Alexander stood before the altar, his chest heaving, his shadow cast long and jagged against the weeping icons of saints. He had not left her. He had arrived to find a massacre. He saw only the empty space where his bride should have been and the trail of blood that led toward the shattered west door. Slowly he reached out, his gauntleted hand, still stained with the soot of the breach, closing around the smoldering veil. He didn't flinch as the embers strung his palm. He crushed the fire out with a ruthless squeeze, the charred lace disintegrating into grey flakes. "Your Grace," a priest stammered, his voice trembling from the shadows. "The city guard. They say Lord Vane has a 6-hour lead. You are wounded. The scandal is already out. You must wait." Alexander turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the polished grace London expected of a Thornbridge. His face was a mask of feral intensity, his blue eyes wide and piercing, locked in a battle-trance that saw through the walls of the church and into the dark heart of the forest where they had dragged her. A single streak of blood ran from his brow, cutting a path through the grime on his cheek. He had already abandoned decorum for violence. He didn't look at the priest. He looked at the wreckage of the wedding, the smashed lilies, the overturned pews, the discarded prayer books. He looked at the spot where Seraphina's hand had last touched his before the world broke. "I will not wait for the guard," Alexander said. His voice was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the floor. It was a sound of absolute, chilling finality. "Every man who stood in this holy place and allowed her to be taken has already signed his death warrant. And Vane." He raised the remains of the veil to his lips, a grim, silent salute to his missing bride. "I will burn the devil's throat to ash to take her back," he vowed, the words falling like iron weights. "I will not bring her back to a world where these men still breathe. If I must become the monster they fear to save her, then God help them all." He turned on his heel, his heavy boots thudding against the marble with the rhythm of a funeral drum. He didn't look back at the ruin of his name or the gasping witnesses. He walked straight into the rain and the fire, leaving the scent of orange blossoms behind for the smell of wet iron and vengeance. The silence that followed Alexander's vow was heavier than the smoke clogging the nave. He stepped over a fallen silver chalice, his eyes scanning the floor not as a grieving groom, but as a predator reading a map of violence. To the onlookers cowering behind the pews, he was the Duke of Thornbridge, a pillar of the peerage. But as he knelt in the center of the aisle, ignoring the blood soaking into the knee of his formal breeches, that man was gone. In his place was a soldier who had seen the worst of the continent, a man who knew that every second wasted was a second Seraphina spent in terror. He found it near the third pew, a brass button torn violently from a coat. It wasn't the uniform of a common thief or the livery of a rival duke. It bore the crest of a jagged sun, the mark of the Blackwood mercenaries, men who didn't kidnap for ransom, they kidnapped for erasure. Alexander's jaw tightened, his teeth bared in a silent, feral snarl. Lord Vane hadn't just stolen his bride. He had hired butchers to ensure she was never found. "Alexander, stop." A hand landed on his shoulder, his cousin, Julian, looking pale and shaken. "You're bleeding from the head. We have to call the magistrates. You cannot simply ride out like this. Think of the scandal, the legality." Alexander stood up, his height looming over Julian like a mountain of cold iron. He didn't speak. Instead, he gripped the front of Julian's fine silk waistcoat and hauled him upward until the man was on his toes. The battle-trance, in Alexander's blue eyes, was terrifying to behold up close. There was no room for legality in that gaze, only the white-hot heat of a man who had already decided to burn the world down. "Do you think I care for the law when she is in the hands of monsters?" Alexander whispered, the sound more frightening than a shout. "Vane wants a war. I am going to give him an apocalypse." He released Julian and stripped off his heavy, ceremonial wedding coat, tossing the expensive velvet onto the blood-stained floor without a second thought. He began to unbutton his waistcoat, his movements frantic yet precise. Underneath the finery, his frame was corded with the scars of old campaigns, muscles tensing as he prepared for a different kind of ceremony. He moved toward the vestry, his boots echoing like a heartbeat against the stone. Inside, he found his valet, a man who had served with him in the Highlands. The servant didn't ask questions, he simply opened a heavy oak chest that had been brought to the cathedral just in case. Alexander didn't reach for a fresh shirt. He reached for his leather brigandine and his heavy iron pauldrons. He strapped the blackened metal over his white wedding linen, the contrast between the pristine lace of his sleeves and the grim utility of the armor creating a silhouette of a warrior noble reborn in chaos. He took up a heavy broadsword, the weight of the hilt familiar and comforting in his soot-stained hand. As he stepped back out into the wreckage of the chapel, the witnesses recoiled. He no longer looked like a duke. He looked like a demon birthed from the very fire that was still consuming the altar. He caught his reflection in a shattered shard of a stained glass window, a mask of grime, dried blood, and absolute, unyielding purpose. "Tell the city guard to stay out of my way," Alexander commanded, his voice echoing through the rafters. "If they follow me into the devil's throat, I will treat them as I treat the kidnappers." He grabbed a discarded torch, its flame licking the air, and walked toward the great doors. Outside, the rain was beginning to fall, a cold London deluge that would wash away the tracks of lesser men. But Alexander didn't need tracks. He could smell the fear of his enemies on the wind, and he could feel the phantom pull of Seraphina's heartbeat leading him into the dark. He mounted his black stallion in one fluid, violent motion, the horse sensing the rider's bloodlust and rearing against the grey sky. With a final, piercing look at the cathedral, the place where his life was supposed to begin, Alexander spurred the beast into a gallop. He left behind the altar of ash and the judgment of the living, riding straight toward the fire, a hunt beginning that no gentleman was ever meant to survive. The transition from the warmth of the cathedral's candles to the biting chill of the devil's throat was a descent into a living nightmare. Seraphina awoke to the rhythmic drip of groundwater hitting stone, a sound that echoed the pounding in her skull. She was no longer in the arms of a duke. She was sprawled on a bed of rotted straw in a cell that smelled of ancient damp and stagnant earth. The air here was thick, tasting of moss and the copper tang of her own fear. She sat up slowly, the movement causing the heavy, cream-colored lace of her wedding gown to hiss against the stone floor. It was a grotesque sight. The intricate floral patterns, hand-sewn by the finest seamstresses in London, were now stained with the black slime of the cave walls and the dark streaks of the struggle in the chapel. The pearls woven into her hair felt like lead weights, and one of her elegant emerald earrings was gone, likely ripped away when they had shoved her into the carriage. Beyond the rusted iron bars of her cell, the devil's throat lived up to its name. It was a subterranean fortress carved into the limestone cliffs, a jagged wound in the earth where the wind whistled like a dying man's breath. Torches sputtered in the distance, casting long, distorted shadows of her captors against the cavern walls. She could hear their rough laughter, the clink of dice, and the occasional mention of Lord Vane's name, a name that tasted like poison in her mouth. Vane wanted her broken. He wanted her to believe that Alexander had seen the chaos and retreated to the safety of his title, leaving her to be discarded as ruined goods. But as Seraphina looked down at her tattered sleeves, she didn't feel the exhausted surrender her kidnappers expected. She felt a cold, sharp spark of defiance. She remembered the look in Alexander's eyes before the smoke had separated them, not fear, but a burgeoning, protective rage. She knew him. He was not a man of half measures. If he lived, he was coming, and if he was coming, he would need a map. With trembling fingers, Seraphina reached for the hem of her underskirt. The silk was strong, designed to endure a night of dancing, not a desperate escape. She gritted her teeth, finding a small tear near the lace border, and pulled. The sound of the fabric rending was like a scream in the quiet cell. She stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening for the heavy footfalls of a guard. Silence returned, save for the wind. She tore a long, thin strip of the cream-colored silk. It was a bright, clean thing in this dark hole, a beacon of high-status luxury that had no business in a den of mercenaries. She crawled toward the back of the cell, where a narrow fissure in the rock allowed a draft of outside air to whistle through. It was too small for a body, but large enough for a message. She pushed the strip of silk into the crevice, letting the wind catch it so it would snag on the jagged rocks outside the hidden entrance. It was a gamble of the highest stakes. If Vane's men found it, they would beat her for her insolence. But if Alexander found it, he would know she was alive. He would know that his bride was not waiting to be saved, she was waiting to be found. She tore another strip, then another, tucking them into her bodice to drop whenever they moved her. Each rip of the lace felt like she was shedding the delicate, protected lady she had been and arming herself with the only weapon she had, her presence. A heavy shadow fell across the bars. Seraphina didn't shrink back. She smoothed the ruined lace over her knees and looked up, her eyes hard and bright despite the single tear that tracked through the grime on her cheek. She was a Whitlock, and she was the chosen mate of a wolf. "Tell Lord Vane," she said, her voice steady and echoing through the damp corridor, "that he should have killed the Duke when he had the chance. Because every minute I am here is a minute the fire gets closer to his throat." The guard laughed, a hollow, mocking sound, but Seraphina didn't look away. She reached into her hair, pulled out a loose pearl, and dropped it silently into the straw at the front of the cell, a trail of white in a world of black. She closed her eyes then, not in surrender, but to better hear the distant, imaginary thud of a black stallion's hooves moving through the storm. The storm over the devil's throat was not merely a tempest of rain. It was a wall of grey ice that clawed at the Duke's skin. Alexander rode through the skeletal trees of the northern forest, his black stallion's breath coming in ragged plumes of white. He was a shadow within a shadow, the blackened iron of his armor slick with water, his eyes scanning the gloom with the hyper-focused clarity of a man who had transcended exhaustion. He smelled them before he saw them. The scent of cheap tobacco and the greasy smoke of a poorly hidden campfire drifted through the pines, cutting through the clean smell of wet earth. Alexander pulled the reins, his horse coming to a silent, practiced halt. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion, his boots sinking into the mud without a sound. Ahead, nestled in a natural hollow of the rock, stood the first outpost of the Blackwood mercenaries. There were 3 of them, rough-hewn men draped in furs and stained wool, huddling around a small flame. One leaned against a jagged hemlock, a heavy musket resting carelessly in the crook of his arm. They were laughing, the sound a jarring intrusion in the hallowed silence of the woods. Alexander reached for the Whitlock pistol tucked into his belt, his thumb hovering over the hammer. But then he stopped. The click of a trigger or the thunder of black powder would echo for miles in this canyon, alerting Vane and the others to his presence. Silence was the only currency he had left to buy Seraphina's safety. He slid the pistol back into its holster. With a slow, deliberate movement, he drew his broadsword. The steel sang a low, mournful note as it left the scabbard, the blade reflecting the orange flicker of the distant fire. He didn't just hold the weapon, he became an extension of it. He moved through the undergrowth with a feral grace that defied his size. He was no longer a duke bound by the rules of the court. He was a wolf reclaiming his territory. He watched the guard by the tree. The man was yawning, his eyes heavy. Alexander waited for the wind to howl, a sudden gust that rattled the frozen branches, and then he struck. He was a blur of iron and shadow. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his hand clamped over the guard's mouth before the man could draw a breath. The broadsword didn't swing, it drove home with surgical, silent precision. The mercenary's eyes widened, the light in them flickering out as Alexander eased him to the ground, preventing the musket from clattering against the stones. The other 2 men at the fire didn't even look up until the Duke stepped into the light of their camp. "What in the—" One started to scramble for his blade, but Alexander was already upon them. He fought with a brutal, rhythmic efficiency. He didn't use the elegant lunges of a fencing master. He used the weight of his armor and the raw power of his protective rage. He parried a desperate knife thrust with his gauntleted forearm, the metal sparking, and followed with a devastating hilt stroke that shattered the man's jaw. The 3rd mercenary turned to flee, but Alexander's blade found him first, a single, sweeping arc that ended the pursuit before it began. Silence returned to the hollow, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Alexander's steady, rhythmic breathing. He stood over the remains of the outpost, his chest heaving, the battle-trance still humming in his veins. He looked down at his sword, now slick with more than just rain, and felt a grim satisfaction. This was the only language Vane understood. Then something caught the light at the edge of the camp. Alexander knelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached toward a jagged branch of a low-hanging briar. Snagged on the thorn was a strip of cream-colored silk, Brussels lace, delicate and out of place in this garden of stone. He pulled it free, the fabric soft and damp against his grime-streaked palm. He closed his eyes, pressing the silk to his face. It smelled of Seraphina, of the faint orange blossom perfume she had worn for their wedding, now mixed with the scent of the cold caves. A guttural sound, half sob and half growl, escaped his throat. She was alive. She was fighting. She was leaving him breadcrumbs in the dark. He tucked the lace into the breast of his tunic, right against his heart, and looked toward the higher peaks of the devil's throat. The fire in his eyes was no longer just rage, it was a beacon. "I am here, Seraphina," he whispered into the wind. He didn't return to his horse. He turned toward the steep, hidden paths of the cliffside, disappearing into the mist with his sword drawn, moving higher into the maw of the mountain where the true monsters waited. The heavy iron door of the cell groaned on its hinges, admitting a sliver of torchlight that cut through the damp gloom like a serrated blade. Lord Vane stepped into the chamber, his boots clicking with an arrogant precision that lacked the honest weight of Alexander's stride. He looked out of place in the cavern, a peacock in a wolf's den, dressed in a midnight blue frock coat that smelled of expensive snuff and stale ambition. Seraphina remained seated in the straw, her back against the weeping stone. She didn't scramble to her feet or plead for mercy. Instead, she adjusted the tattered remnants of her wedding lace with a slow, regal deliberation that seemed to unsettle him. "The priest is waiting in the upper hall, Seraphina," Vane said, his voice smooth and oily, though his eyes darted toward the shadows. "The witnesses are the men you see in the corridors, not the wedding you dreamed of, perhaps, but a wedding nonetheless. Once the papers are signed and the union consummated, Thornbridge will have nothing to claim but a memory." Seraphina looked up, the single tear on her cheek having dried into a faint, salt-streaked path. She saw the tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his cuffs. Vane wasn't acting out of strength. He was acting out of a desperate, panicked greed. He was terrified of the silence outside the fortress. "You speak of marriage as if it were a business transaction, Arthur," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, echoing with a hollow, crystalline clarity. "But look at you. You are sweating in a cold cave. You hear the wind outside and wonder if it is the storm or if it is the sound of a man who does not know how to stop." Vane's face flushed a mottled red. "Thornbridge is a broken man. He was humiliated before the entire ton. He sits in his chapel counting his losses while I secure my future." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Seraphina stood up then, the ruined silk of her gown whispering against the stone. She moved toward him, stopping only when the iron bars were between them. She was shorter than him, but in the flickering light, her shadow loomed tall. "Alexander is not a man of ledgers and scandal. He is a man of blood and iron. You didn't just steal a bride. You stole the only thing that kept the monster inside him in check." She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "You want to marry me now? In this state? Look at this dress. It is a shroud. If you force this ceremony while I am covered in the filth of your cell, the ton will not see a legitimate union. They will see a kidnapping. They will see a crime that even your cousins in Parliament cannot bury." Vane hesitated, his ego snagging on her words. He had always prided himself on his refined reputation. "I need time," Seraphina continued, her voice dropping to a persuasive, conspiratorial hum. "If this is to hold weight, I must at least look like a woman who chose her fate. Give me an hour to wash, to mend what can be mended. Let me stand before your priest as a lady of Whitlock, not a prisoner. Unless, of course, you are so afraid of one man that you cannot spare 60 minutes for your own dignity." The jab hit its mark. Vane's chest puffed out, his vanity overrunning his caution. He hated Alexander, hated the Duke's effortless power, his military record, his terrifying competence. The idea of winning properly, of parading a composed Seraphina before the world to prove he had mastered her, was too tempting to resist. 1 hour, Vane snapped, signaling to the guard. Bring water and a seamstress's kit, but do not think to flee. There is only one way out of the throat, and my men hold every inch of it. Of course, Seraphina murmured, stepping back into the shadows as the door was relocked. She listened to his retreating footsteps, her heart thundering so loudly she feared the guard might hear it. She had bought an hour, 60 minutes for the man who was currently carving a path through the forest. She looked down at her hands, they were shaking, but she forced them still. She didn't need a seamstress's kit to mend a dress. She needed the steel needle and the heavy thread to fashion a different kind of tool. She knew Alexander was close. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the mercenaries' laughter had turned into hushed, nervous whispers. He wasn't just coming for her, he was hunting them. Every second she delayed Vane was a second Alexander used to close the distance. She knelt in the straw and picked up a heavy, jagged stone she had loosened from the wall. She began to sharpen the long steel needle the guard had just tossed through the bars. She was no longer just a bride in a burning dress. She was the anvil, and Alexander was the hammer, and between them, Lord Vane was about to be broken. The ascent into the upper reaches of the Devil's Throat was a vertical climb through a purgatory of freezing mist and jagged shale. Alexander moved with a predatory silence that had long since replaced the measured stride of a nobleman. His heavy iron pauldrons were slick with condensation, and the white silk of his wedding shirt, torn and stained with the grime of the climb, clung to his skin like a second, bruised skin. Every muscle in his body screamed with the exertion of the hunt, but the battle-trance was a cold, efficient master. It filtered out the pain, leaving only the tactical geometry of the terrain and the singular, burning need to reach the summit. He reached a narrow ledge where the wind howled through a natural fissure in the rock. Here, the scent of the mercenaries' wood smoke was stronger, but there was something else. He knelt, his gauntleted hand brushing against a low, thorny shrub that clung to the precipice. There, fluttering like the wing of a broken bird, was a strip of cream-colored lace. Alexander pulled it free. This wasn't a piece of fabric torn by accident or shredded in a struggle. The edges were clean, deliberately rendered. He ran his thumb over the intricate floral pattern, the Brussels lace he had commissioned himself, now damp with the mountain's breath. As he turned the scrap over, his heart gave a violent, painful thud against his ribs. Pinned through the silk was a single, long steel needle, its tip blackened by soot. It was a message, a weapon, a sign of life. Seraphina wasn't just surviving, she was marking her path with the very finery that was supposed to symbolize her submission. She was stripping away the tragic bride and revealing the steel beneath. The realization hit Alexander with the force of a physical blow, shattering the icy detachment of his rage and replacing it with a fierce, humbling pride. She was fighting her own war in the dark, and she was expecting him to meet her at the finish line. "Brave girl," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp that was lost to the gale. He tucked the lace into his brigandine, right alongside the first scrap he had found. The two pieces felt like a talisman, a tether pulling him upward. His determination, which had been a blunt instrument of vengeance, sharpened into a lethal, focused intent. He was no longer just a man looking for a victim. He was a husband going to join his partner in a slaughter. He looked up toward the silhouette of the ruined forest fortress. The wind shifted, bringing with it the sound of a distant, discordant bell. Vane's ceremony was beginning, the Duke's teeth bared in a mask of feral intensity. He saw the guard towers now, two men packing the ramparts with muskets held tight against the cold. They were looking for an army, for the city guard, for a formal siege. They were not looking for a single, mud-streaked demon rising from the shadows of the cliff face. Alexander abandoned the main path entirely. He began to scale the sheer outer wall of the stronghold, his fingers bleeding as they found purchase in the frozen cracks of the masonry. Each movement was a calculated risk, a dance with gravity that should have been impossible for a man in heavy plate, but the weight of the lace in his pocket made him light. The knowledge that Seraphina was waiting, needle in hand and fire in her heart, gave him the strength of 10 men. He reached the base of a high, narrow window, the very fissure Seraphina had used to drop her trail. He could hear voices inside, the panicked, high-pitched orders of Lord Vane and the low, grumbling responses of men who realized their fortress was no longer a sanctuary. Alexander gripped the stone sill, his knuckles white. He looked directly into the dark interior, his piercing blue eyes catching the faint glow of the torches within. He wasn't a gentleman anymore. He was the storm. He was the consequence of Lord Vane's every sin. And as he heaved himself over the ledge and into the lion's den, the only thing more dangerous than the sword in his hand was the smile that touched his lips, the smile of a man who had finally found his way home. The stone corridor inside the fortress was a tunnel of choking smoke and flickering shadows. Alexander moved through the gloom like a ghost of iron, his sword held low, his boots treading softly on the damp floor. He was mere levels away from Seraphina, the pull of her presence acting as a compass. But as he rounded a corner toward the central barracks, a figure stepped out from the darkness, blocking his path. The man didn't look like the other mercenaries. He wore the high-collared greatcoat of a regular officer, and the way he held his saber spoke of years in the king's cavalry. As the torchlight hit his face, Alexander froze. The battle-trance wavered, replaced by a cold, sickening shock. Nathaniel, Alexander's voice was a jagged rasp. Captain Nathaniel Grave had been Alexander's second-in-command at Waterloo. They had shared rations in the mud of Flanders and bled in the same trenches. Nathaniel was the man Alexander had trusted to oversee the chapel's security, the man who was supposed to be the shield at the wedding. "I didn't think you'd make the climb, Alex," Nathaniel said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. He didn't look ashamed. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed by a hollow kind of greed. "Vane offered me more than a lifetime of soldiers' half-pay ever could. He offered me an estate in the south. All I had to do was look the other way for 10 minutes. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. The warrior noble in Alexander didn't roar. It went utterly, terrifyingly still. The grime on his face, the blood on his brow, and the soot-stained wedding shirt under his armor all seemed to darken. The man who had stood by him in war had sold Seraphina's life for a piece of dirt in Sussex. 10 minutes, Alexander whispered, the words like falling ice. In those 10 minutes, they dragged her through the dirt. They tore the veil from her head. They shed the blood of our men on the altar. "It's just a woman, Alex. You could have had any girl in London," Nathaniel snapped, his hand tightening on his hilt. "Vane will be Duke in all but name soon. Join us. I can tell him you arrived too late, that we fought off the real kidnappers together. We can walk out of here as heroes." Alexander didn't answer with words. He lunged. The confrontation was a collision of two masters of the blade, but while Nathaniel fought with the polished precision of the academy, Alexander fought with the feral intensity of a man protecting his soul. They spilled out of the corridor and onto an open stone rampart, the freezing rain of the devil's throat lashing down upon them. The ring of steel against steel was a frantic, rhythmic scream against the thunder. Nathaniel was fast, his saber whistling through the air, but Alexander was a force of nature. He ignored a shallow cut across his shoulder, stepping into the arc of Nathaniel's blade to deliver a crushing blow with his gauntleted fist. "You were my brother," Alexander roared, the sound echoing off the cliff walls. "Brothers don't let brothers rot in poverty while they marry heiresses," Nathaniel countered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He lunged for Alexander's throat, a desperate, lethal thrust, but Alexander didn't parry. He caught the blade in his left hand, the heavy leather and iron of his gauntlet shrieking as the steel bit in. He didn't flinch. He used the momentum to pull Nathaniel closer, burying his own broadsword deep into the traitor's chest. The rain washed the blood from Nathaniel's coat as he slumped against the battlements. The light faded from his eyes, replaced by a look of sudden, panicked clarity. Alexander didn't look away. He held the man until the final breath escaped him, his face a mask of grim, sorrowful stone. He withdrew his blade and stood up, the rain drenching his hair and stinging the fresh cuts on his skin. He felt the weight of the lace in his pocket, Seraphina's trail, and the pain of the betrayal burned away, leaving only a white-hot core of purpose. Nathaniel had been the last piece of his old life, the last tie to a world of gentlemanly honor. That world was dead. He turned toward the inner sanctum, his boots splashing in the puddles of blood and rainwater. He didn't look back at the man he had once called brother. Vane was all that remained, and as the Duke of Thornbridge moved into the final depths of the fortress, He looked less like a man and more like the vengeance of God, rising from the storm to reclaim what was his. The smell of burning pitch and old timber cut through the frozen mountain air, sharper and more violent than the scent of the rain. From the heights of the central keep, a thick, oily plume of black smoke began to curl into the grey sky, turning the mist into a choking shroud. Lord Vane had seen the shadow of the Duke on the ramparts. He had seen the broken bodies of his best mercenaries and the death of his master at arms. In his cowardice, he had chosen to rule a graveyard rather than face the man he had wronged. Inside the lower corridors, the heat rose with terrifying speed. The ancient wooden supports of the forest fortress, dried by centuries of wind and now soaked in accelerant, roared to life. The whiplash was total. The biting cold of the devil's throat was instantly replaced by a blistering, orange wall of heat that turned the stone hallways into an oven. Alexander was 3 levels below the sanctuary when the first explosion of heat hit him. He skidded to a halt as a secondary ceiling beam collapsed ahead, showering the corridor in a fountain of sparks. Through the shimmering haze of the fire, he heard it, not a scream of terror, but the defiant, rhythmic banging of metal against stone. Seraphina. She was signaling to him through the roar of the inferno. The battle-trance shifted from a predator's crawl to an all-consuming, desperate sprint. Alexander broke into a dead run, his heavy iron armor clattering with a frantic, rhythmic violence. The weight of the plate, which had been his shield against blades, now became a furnace, the metal heating against his skin. He didn't slow. He didn't shield his eyes. He charged through a curtain of falling embers, his boots thudding against the floorboards as they groaned and buckled beneath him. He could see Vane's men now, panicked and fleeing toward the rear exits, abandoning their posts as the roof began to shed burning shingles like autumn leaves. Alexander didn't stop to engage them. He was a force of singular, kinetic intent. He shouldered through a heavy oak door that was already wreathed in flames, the wood splintering under the impact of his iron pauldrons. "Seraphina," he roared, his voice a guttural explosion that challenged the crackle of the fire. The smoke was thickening, turning the world into a bokeh blur of orange and charcoal. His lungs burned with every breath of ash, but his eyes remained locked on the path ahead. He reached the base of the spiral stairs leading to the inner sanctum, the bride's gambit chamber. The stairs were a chimney, funneling the heat upward. He saw a shadow move above him, Lord Vane, clutching a lockbox and a torch, scurrying toward a hidden servant's passage. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second through the haze. Vane's face was a mask of pure, shivering horror. He looked at Alexander and saw not a man, but a demon birthed from the very fire he had lit. Vane dropped the torch and fled into the dark, but Alexander didn't follow. The Duke turned toward the cell where the rhythmic banging had grown louder. He reached the door, the iron handle searing his palm through his gauntlet. He didn't reach for a key. He stepped back, drew his breath into the depths of his aching lungs, and threw his entire weight against the lock. The wood shrieked, the iron groaned. Behind the door he heard her voice, clear, sharp, and filled with a terrifyingly beautiful relief. "Alexander!" With one final, violent heave, the door gave way. Alexander stumbled into the room, a silhouette of soot and blood framed by the inferno behind him. He looked across the smoke-filled chamber and saw her, Seraphina, standing amidst the ruins of her wedding gown, holding a sharpened needle and a heavy stone, her eyes bright with a fire that matched the one consuming the world. The fortress was dying around them, the timbers screaming as they prepared to give way. But as Alexander took the final steps toward her, the battle-trance finally broke, leaving only the raw, trembling heart of a man who had crawled through hell to find his heaven. The final descent through the gullet of the devil's throat was a journey through the heart of a sun. The air was no longer something to be breathed. It was a liquid weight of ash and heat that lunged at Alexander's lungs with every step. He carried Seraphina high against his chest, his ironclad arms creating a cradle of cold metal amidst the screaming orange heat. Beams groaned like dying giants above them, and the very stones of the fortress seemed to weep soot as the structural marrow of the keep disintegrated. Alexander did not look at the path. He looked at the woman in his arms, his wide, piercing blue eyes never leaving her face even as he kicked through a wall of falling timber. He was waiting for the moment the battle-trance would cost him her love. He was acutely aware of the horror he embodied. The dried blood of his former brother Nams caked on his brow, the feral snarl still etched into his features, and the scent of death that clung to his armor more tightly than the soot. He was a monster who had broken into a cage to retrieve a bird, and he expected her to scream when she finally saw the gore on his hands. As they burst through the final, crumbling archway and out onto the rain-slicked precipice of the mountain, the temperature plummeted. The transition was a violent shock of ice and wind. Alexander stumbled, his knees hitting the mud of the cliffside as the fortress behind them exhaled one final spectacular plume of fire. The roar of the collapse was deafening, a funeral pyre for the men who had dared to touch what was his. He knelt there in the freezing deluge, his chest heaving, his head bowed. The adrenaline that had fueled his warrior-noble ascent began to drain, leaving behind a raw, trembling exhaustion. Slowly, fearfully, he loosened his grip, prepared for Seraphina to recoil from the mask of violence he had become. He looked up at her through the rain, his face a landscape of grime and silver-blue intensity, his teeth still bared in a lingering, protective reflex. "Seraphina," he rasped, the name catching in a throat raw from smoke. I am sorry you had to see this man." He waited for her to pull away. He waited for the judgment of London to return to her eyes. Instead, he felt her hands, cold, small, and covered in the dust of her own resistance, reach up to cup his face. She didn't shrink. She didn't shudder. Her fingers traced the line of blood on his forehead, her touch a searing benediction against his skin. Seraphina leaned forward, pulling herself back into the hollow of his neck, her arms locking around his heavy iron pauldrons with a strength that rivaled his own. She held him tighter, her face pressed against the soot-stained wedding silk of his shoulder. The single tear on her cheek was washed away by the rain, replaced by a look of fierce, unyielding possession. "You think I fear the man who burned the world to find me?" she whispered, her voice a low, steady flame against the storm. "I have never seen anything more beautiful than your rage, Alexander, because it belongs to me." The Duke's eyes closed, and for the first time since the first scream in the chapel, his muscles relaxed. The feral intensity didn't vanish, but it transformed, it became a vow. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing the tattered lace of her dress against his blackened plate, and let the rain wash the blood from their skin. They were no longer the Duke and Lady of a polite, fragile society. They were survivors of an inferno, bonded by the shared iron of their wills. Below them, the lights of a distant search party began to flicker in the valley, but Alexander didn't move. He held her in the dark, on the edge of the world, making a final, silent vow that required no priest and no witnesses. He would never again be the man who waited at the altar. He would be the man who stood at the gates of hell. And as Seraphina pulled back to look into his eyes, she saw the monster and the lover, and she chose them both. Together, they turned away from the embers of the devil's throat, walking into the cold, clean rain of a new and dangerous dawn.